My name is Sue Tompkins. This is the first of a series of films about forecasting using astrology. And if you're watching this, I'm assuming that you know something of Western astrology. Perhaps you're attending a class in a school, or you've been reading or studying my books on astrology, Contemporary Astrologers' Handbooks, or my book on aspects. So it is, to do forecasting, it is essential that you know something of that you know quite a bit actually about the language of particularly the planets, the signs and the houses. Whenever you're looking at a chart from a what is going on point of view, you always have to use common sense, the context of the person or the chart you're looking at. How old are they? Where are they living? I mean, if you're born in Tanzania, most people born in Tanzania won't live to see 80, for example, and they may not live till 50 years of age. So you have to have kind of context here. And the context of how you will receive a transit if you're 5 or 15 or 25 or 40 or 80. Forecasting inevitably throws up questions of fate and free will. Who knows how much free will we do or we don't have? Is it fated that I am talking to you now at this moment and that you're listening to it at whatever moment you are listening to it or watching it? Perhaps it is, as the psychologist C.G. Jung said, that we all have free will, but not the will to use it. In any event, our job, as I see it anyway, is to use astrology to increase free will, to make choices more consciously. I believe that each of us are responsible for our successes and failures, and that we do have some responsibility for the world around us. I'll be talking a little bit more about this in the next film. But what astrology offers is knowledge of the unseen underbelly of things. An unseen underbelly that one may not be conscious of. So in which case we have a situation of responsibility plus ignorance. Responsibility plus ignorance equals potential dire situation. So the idea of having some kind of knowledge or some kind of familiarity of the language of this underbelly helps us to not be so ignorant, I suppose. And I believe that a lot of the time we should be interpreting events more than forecasting them. It is a law of science that we change things by looking at them, and rather than trying to predict what will happen next, maybe we should be concentrating a little bit more on what is happening now. In Western society, we tend to hook into individual circumstances, but if astrology teaches anything, it is that we are all interrelated, that all life is interrelated. Curiously, from your chart, it might be easier for me to predict the outcome of events for your husband or your wife or your mother or your father. This is because your fate is being changed by your studying it. So the natal chart is a map of potential. I suppose that's all I really want to say. Anyway, in this talk I will be talking about the outer planets. We're going to use the word transit, but I also mean direction, and to some extent progressions, but directions. Even if you don't know what these are, we will come to be studying directions. When I'm talking about outer planet transits, really I'm mostly talking about conjunctions and hard aspects, so the opposition, the square, but also the semi-square and the sesquiquadrate, and maybe the quincunx. But as you'll see in examples that I will be sharing with you over the course of the films, semi-squares and sesquiquadrates you do need to include. So a semi-square is 45 degrees, it's half a square, and you'd use maybe a 2-degree orb. And a sesquiquadrate is a square, that's 90 degrees, plus a semi-square, 45, so that comes to 135 degrees. And those two aspects, the meaning as far as one knows is similar, but I do use them, and for both of them would use a 2-degree orb. Anyway, outer planet transits, why I've started with those, is that they are life-changing aspects. Jupiter and Saturn describe the peaks and the troughs, the ups and downs of everyday life. All sorts of things may indeed happen with Jupiter and Saturn, but you're not likely to remember them years later, unless you've got an extraordinarily good memory. Without a planet transit, you'll know the year. You'll say, yes, 1994, that is the year that ... happened, or that is the year I decided to, etc. Of course, in the midst of outer planet activity, there will invariably be other things going on as well, maybe from Jupiter, maybe from Saturn, or maybe progression. So the rule of 3 applies to forecasting as much as it does to natal chart interpretation. And by the rule of 3, I mean if something is going to happen, it has to be shown more than once, at least 3 times. I usually call it the rule of the 3-legged stool. If a stool doesn't have 3 legs, it will fall down. Let's say you were going to start a business, and this is the first time you'd been self-employed and you were going to launch this business. For you, it's a big thing. It won't be shown by just one thing in your chart. It will be shown 3 or 4 different ways. And you may have other people start in a business, but it will mean something different to them. And the transits, progressions and directions will be different, although it will still include certain things we associate with being self-employed or starting a business, maybe activity around the midheaven or the 6th house or rulers of those houses. But the rule of the 3-legged stool very much applies to forecasting. And the other important point is that whatever outer planet activity is going on, we must also look at what else is going on. So you have to look at the whole thing. And before I start proper, I want to say something about orbs. Does a transit, does a progression, does a direction have to be exact? And the answer is no. I use fairly tight orbs myself for natal work and for forecasting work, maybe 2 degrees. But you have to differentiate between the event and the process. Like, imagine you're going to buy your first flat. There is the date that you make the purchase, there's the date you move in, but there's also the decision to... So let's imagine you're living with your parents and you've been wanting to move out for a time, and perhaps you've been saving up, perhaps you've been looking around. But the process of moving will take a year, maybe 2, whereas the actual event won't take that long at all. So there's a psychological process. Let's imagine that Uranus, transiting Uranus, is going to pick up a moon in the 4th house. Maybe the event is about you becoming more independent, emotionally independent, domestically independent. You'll be independent, you're in your own house. Well, the whole issue of psychologically being independent will take much longer. It will be a process. So there's always a difference between process and event. So imagine that Uranus is conjunct your moon. You're not going to have it, and maybe it's there on and off for some years. You're not going to have an event every day that describes that, but the psychological process in the background will be going on. All right, well, let's start with thinking about... actually, before I do start on that, an important thing to say about all sorts of things that happen in astrology, including outer planet activity, is just to remind us that very often planets come in the guise of people or places. For example, maybe you're in the midst of Pluto transits. And your life will become full, maybe, of people their charts vibrate very strongly to Pluto. And perhaps they have lots of planets in the sign of Scorpio, or lots of hard aspects to their natal Pluto. Arguably, that person is there to teach us about the given energy, to get us through. They act like a guide. Or sometimes it's the places we travel to. Under Pluto transits, maybe we would go to Japan. And you might say, well, why Japan? Well, because Japan we associate with Pluto, really. Think of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and even the recent earthquake and the nuclear power plant. Or the Canary Islands is another place that mops up Pluto because it's made, or some of the islands anyway, are made up of volcanic ash. Now, if you lived in Japan, obviously your Pluto transits will be shown in a different place. But I can assure you that there are many different examples of this. Under Uranus transits, Europeans go to Australia, for example, or Iceland. Australia, because Australia is peopled by convicts, people who have been rejected by the mother country, the UK or Ireland. I mean, not nowadays, their ancestors hundreds of years ago. One more thing to say is that us astrologers tend to project onto the planets the quality of the planets. So we get fearful of Saturn transits, completely exaggerate the possibility of something wonderful happening under Jupiter transits, which don't happen. It's more like a balloon that gets burst. And we get sometimes terrified of Pluto transits, mostly without good reason. Remember that the cause of disappointment is expectation. I'm not saying we shouldn't have expectations in life. If we didn't have expectations, we wouldn't grow, we wouldn't prosper, we wouldn't move forward. But it is because our expectations sometimes fall short of reality that people discover being disappointed. Anyway, let's start with Uranus. Here's a slide 2. Uranus, as you'll know, has a 84-year cycle, spends 7 years in a sign, and so it moves very slowly. To the old occultist, a lifespan is in fact 84 years, the complete orbit of Uranus, although in Christian biblical terms it's 70 years in 10. But the old occult idea was a Uranus return. Of course, people live a lot longer than their Uranus returns quite often. But anyway, one of the purposes of Uranus transits, it seems to be to wake us up. And Uranus has always been known as the awakener, and whatever the event is, that is what happens. There is an awakening. And of course, as an aside, people famously don't sleep under Uranus transits. If Uranus is particularly going through their 12th house, the area of the chart we associate with sleep, they just can't sleep. They're awake all the time. They're buzzing. You'll be aware that would-be astrologers, possibly including yourself, discover astrology under the influence of Uranus. And it's a nice, benign manifestation. It's exciting. Astrology is exciting. When people discover astrology really works, their head goes zing, they feel alive. The whole perception of the world has changed. And change is one of the things we associate with Uranus. We associate change with all the outer planets, but with Uranus, it's kind of real change. In fact, Uranus physically is always full of surprises. I understand that nowadays Uranus has 27 moons, when I last looked anyway, named after Shakespearean characters or characters from Alexander Pope. And 6 rings only recently discovered. Even physically, Uranus is full of surprises. And astrologers usually tell clients to expect the unexpected with Uranus directions and transits. And it's true, the planet rarely brings what the individual expects. There is almost always an element of surprise or shock. Surprise if we like what it brings, shock if we don't very often. Uranus always challenges whatever is stuck, sterile, stultified. That very area of life that seems to be sorted or at least stable, that area of life that you take for granted, it may not be perfect. If it was, maybe there wouldn't be room for change, but that's the kind of area that calls for Uranus. And Uranus can completely change a life around. Uranus doesn't tinker. A key word for Uranus is revolution, which literally means to turn over. And Uranus hitting personal planets or the angles can completely revolutionize a life. And whatever Uranus brings is often drastic in its action, drastic and sudden and unexpected. Clients, which brings me to a little deviation about whether something's a surprise or a shock. Clients often ask whether something is good or bad, and I think we have to get away from such concepts in astrology. We may like some things, we may dislike others, but the concept of good and bad is very simplistic. But suffice it to say that there's no such thing as good or bad, really. There just is. And maybe, just maybe, that whatever happens is what is supposed to happen, whether we like it or not. And we are all part of a collective fate. So in some sense, we're driven by something that, to some extent, is beyond our control. But anyway, going back to Uranus, another purpose of Uranian activity seems to be that of heralding the truth. The oh my God moment as realization of something dawns. For example, imagine transiting Uranus is making aspect to some emotional planets, or it's in relationship houses, let's say both, and a given individual is hell-bent on divorce. He or she may have discovered that their partner's been playing away for years. And they have this oh my God moment. So in such circumstances, divorce beckons, not necessarily because of an affair, but because of the overriding Uranian urge for space, for freedom, for independence. Because that's what Uranus transits tend to do. They push us towards this idea of freedom, often separation, but space and independence. That's what Uranus transits bring in some way, in some area of life. Because as I say, Uranus does tend to push towards independence, and independence implies separation. It could be independent thinking. If you're an independent thinker, you're not wedded to the thoughts and views of others, whether they're people in public life or whether they're people that you are close to. And the Uranian oh my God moments can happen in any area of life, depending on what is being picked up, which planets in your natal chart, what houses, and what houses are ruled by Uranus or by the planet being picked up. So with transits, there's the issue of what is in the natal chart. What does that mean? What is the thing that's being triggered? And then there is the actual planet doing the trigger in. A lot of actually major health issues come with Uranian transits because of this oh my God moment. Of course, that explains why I've been having such and such and such and such symptom. So Uranus is the harbinger of truth. But of course there's different types of truth. Uranian truth has no shades of grey. It tends to be uncompromising, sharp, cold, cutting, unemotional. There's no place for sentiment or negotiation on planet Uranus. There is usually a feeling of excitement, of expectation in terms of whatever is being picked up by Uranus. Even in the statement, I went home and my house had got hit by an earthquake. But even in that statement, there's an element of excitement attached. A lot of other feelings too, some of them perhaps very painful. We're all different, we all might experience it differently. But the joy of the Uranian experience is about being taken away from one's routine, being jolted out of one's everyday, ordinary life. So Uranus has, of course, gone into Aries. And the awakening we are seeing in people is very much an awakening of the individual, a light getting turned on. For the last, 2008-ish, anyway, for the last while, Uranus, slow-moving planet, has been squaring Pluto, another slow-moving planet. And Pluto is in Capricorn, it's the stuff of governments and the stuff of power, and then you've got Uranus in Aries, the individuals saying, well, I want this, I'm not going to negotiate. And various stories around the world have been to do with this square. Okay, so I'm going to go on now to Neptune. And Neptune has, I'll just put the slide on, Neptune has a 165-year cycle. So none of us will experience Neptune coming back to its natal place. So Neptune spends 14 years in a sign. So if we think of the idea of the outer planets by transit having a purpose, then the purpose of a Neptune transit might be to show us that things are not what they seem. Of course, it's very debatable whether there is a purpose involved, but it's a very helpful way of thinking about transits. So this idea of a different order of reality. There's a Saturn reality, like this desk is a Saturn reality. It's, you can feel it, you can measure it, you can touch it, it is there. It's consensus reality, it is there. But then there's also, does this table, do I have an aura? Things are often not what they seem. And so we're looking at what Neptune often encourages to do is to look at different levels of reality. So Neptune transits take us away from 2 + 2 = 4. Nothing is what it seems. So Neptune is very good. If you're having Neptune transits to personal planets, a good way to use them is in the arts, film, photography, art, music, and all spiritual pursuits. Particularly Neptune is in Pisces now, so perhaps one particularly thinks of the fine arts and music and ballet. But whatever is going on, Neptune pulls us away from consensus reality. It pulls us away from the earth, pulls us away from worldly considerations, and instead seems to pull us towards that which is more ethereal, magical, wondrous. And it can all be a delusion. Neptune is the planet of delusions. But what is a delusion from the standpoint of consensus reality is not necessarily a delusion. It's a distortion. Neptune brings about distortions of consensus reality, like the artist does. An artist will exaggerate one part of a painting or a photograph in order to make that part stand out and be seen. So it slightly changes the reality, and that's what Neptune does. So the other thing that Neptune brings confusion in its wake and disillusion as well. It's the stuff of anxiety when things are not clear. You just can't understand what's going on. You kind of lose your grip. Each of the outer planets are kind of at odds with Saturn the planet of definition. Neptune is the most anti-definition planet, kind of nothing is what it seems. Neptune, one of the things that Neptune tends to do is it tends to weaken and undermine our ambition. Weaken and undermine not only our grip on reality, our grip on the material world, but on our very anchorage in the world, which is why it can feel a bit confusing, a bit weird, really. It's the planet to associate with resignation. Literally resignation when you retire from a job, when you resign something, you just say, oh, let it go then. But this idea of accepting, Neptune is literally a planet of retirement. Neptune weakens one's fight, one's oomph, one's drive. The fight is gone in a way. And if one is a more spiritual person, perhaps one is not so driven, not striving. I mean, if you were a nun or a monk, you would be living a Neptunian life, at least to some extent. You particularly notice this kind of softening of the oomph and driven quality of yourself or others when Neptune is, in some sense, hitting a fiery planet like the Sun and Mars. And in some cases, Neptune may bring around disorders that literally sap one's drive and vitality. But even if that doesn't happen, there's the kind of feeling of, oh well, never mind, which can be part of a spiritual transit, really. Because if we go back to the notion of purpose, Neptune teaches us that perhaps the purpose of life is not necessarily to be rushing around, not with Neptune transits anyway. Maybe the gods are asking us to be rather than do. Doing for charity is fine, and people often do stuff for charity or charitable causes when Neptune is hitting personal planets, say, in the chart, or maybe the ascendant. In some sense, one can be more compassionate, more open to the needs of others or of society. That's what Neptune does, it opens us. But in being more open, we're less focused. And in being more open to others, we're less focused on ourselves. So doing for charity is a very good way to use many Neptune transits, but the more direct ego doing doesn't go well with Neptune. Neptune undermines ego. If one gets ill under Neptune activity, it will usually be something that defies diagnosis, defies this word definition again. Saturn, as I said, Neptune, as I said, is pitted against Saturn. It's always for this reason of being anti-definition. And the idea of being open to something. So Neptune could be touching your Venus. Perhaps you're more open to love. Neptune to the descendant or to the moon. You're more open to others. Just the idea of being more open is a very positive way. But of course, in being more open, it goes along very often with being more idealistic, and Neptune, of course, is the planet of ideals. But also the notion of being gullible and being easily deluded. So Neptune is the planet of mystical experiences and spiritual awakenings. It's the planet to associate with romance and falling in love in some sense, with bliss and awe. And if it's fallen in love, it has a more impersonal quality about it. Neptune sometimes brings about, like, say you had Neptune transits to Venus or the descendant, say, it will often be more platonic relationships. It's not so physical, it's more spiritual. It's more about longing and idealism and wanting to merge with another. As I say, Neptune is very much the planet that is very egoless. When we merge with another, or merge with an idea, or merge with a spiritual discipline, there's less I and more we involved. So Neptune's very good for that. On another level, it's the planet of scandal. Things are not clear. There's no definition. It's the stuff of scandal and libel and slander and deceit and lies, basically. Falsehoods. Things are not what they seem with Neptune, for good or for ill. I have a few more slides of a Neptune nature, and they are, here, slide 5 and 6, showing fog. And that gives you a little clue about how to deal with Neptune. Things aren't clear when it's foggy. And if you're driving in the fog, you have to drive slowly. You cannot see in front of you. And that's really how to deal with life under Neptune transits. You can't see clearly, so just feel your way around, go more slowly. If you happen to be on foot when there's a thick fog, your senses are often more sensitized. You can smell things around you. You can hear things more. A bit like being a blind person, really. So it's good for your senses generally, but you can't see that far ahead. So it's best not to make too many long-range decisions. And another little aside about Neptune, I discovered that Neptune has 13 moons. That may be slightly different to what's in my book. But the biggest moon, which is Triton, it's a very large moon. It was discovered by William Lassell. But what I didn't know until recently is that William Lassell was a brewer. And it was the sales of beer that made it possible for him to discover Triton and other moons, which are named after sea gods and sea nymphs. You'll all know that Neptune is a planet of alcohol and drugs. And really, sometimes Neptune transits can feel a bit like you've drunk too much. You know how, in some way, you're more chilled. But on the other hand, you miss things. And again, things are not what they seem. They may seem more wondrous, they may seem more terrible. You can get anxiety under Neptune transit. But anyway, to move on to Pluto, and going back to this notion of, is there a purpose? This is slide 7 here. Here's Pluto. Pluto has a 248-year cycle, but it's a very elliptical orbit, so sometimes it can be 12 years in a sign. It was a very short time in Scorpio, for example, and it could be 30 plus years in a sign. It was ages in Leo. Right now, Pluto is in Capricorn, where it entered in 2008, at the beginning of the financial crisis, and it comes out of Capricorn in 2023. And nowadays with Pluto, Pluto has been demoted. It was demoted in 2006. It used to be called a planet. We still call it a planet, but it isn't. The official term is a dwarf planet. So it was demoted in 2006. And actually, the notion of being demoted is a Plutonian one. I mean, it is the planet of redundancy. Not when you give up your job or you're sacked, but when you're made redundant, or you're demoted in some way. You can always hear Pluto there. Interestingly, when Pluto was demoted, Ceres was promoted. So the asteroid Ceres and Pluto are both dwarf planets. But it doesn't make Pluto any less important in the horoscope. But going back to this idea of, is there a purpose to these outer planet transits? I think that one of the main purposes of Pluto transits is about actually downsizing. It's also about cleansing and purging and downsizing. As I say, you can literally see it at work at times of redundancy if Pluto's going over the midheaven perhaps, or the 10th or the 6th house. If you have Pluto natally in one of these houses, you may be more likely to be made redundant. But downsizing is just another word for pruning. Well, if you're made redundant, there's nothing you can do about it. It's not you that has been downsized, really. It is your job. But when people are in this situation, they feel as if they've got the sack, whereas actually it's the job that's going. So downsizing, another word for pruning, and you'll know that with plants, that to prune a plant is you're taking away the dead wood so it can grow better. I also associate Pluto with forest fires, where everything seems to be dead, but the vegetation grows very lush afterwards. So they're very Pluto images. And astrologers often talk about power and Pluto, but in practice, Pluto often has much more to do with impotence and powerlessness than it does, I think, with power. Of course, we often see people come to power under Pluto transits, but there'll always be something else going on too, maybe to do with the sun and the midheaven. Anyway, there may be outer power, but there's often an inward feeling of being humbled. That's another thing that Pluto does. It precipitates events that cut us down to size, that demote us in some way. And you'll see examples of this in a minute. There's often an inward feeling of being humbled, and in a feeling of powerlessness. And Pluto often brings embarrassment and humbling in its wake. If we associate Saturn with the idea of fear, then embarrassment is a key feeling of Pluto. So thinking of this idea of embarrassment, that we quite often have small events of embarrassment. And in Britain we have this expression, if you've said something embarrassing, we have this expression, I wish the ground had opened up and swallowed me up. It's like you're just so embarrassed you want to hide. And it's very interesting because, of course, in mythology, that's what Hades did. Hades, the planet you'd associate in Greek terms with Pluto, the idea of living in the underworld, the ground opening up and swallowing, in fact, Persephone up. So it's what the ground opened up in order that Hades could abduct Persephone and whisk her off to the underworld. You may remember that Persephone was gathering flowers and Hades caused a flower of enormous size and beauty to grow out of the ground just in front of her. And when the goddess plucked the flower up, the earth opened up, Hades appeared in his chariot and seized the struggling Persephone. She didn't have a chance. She was powerless. And he did this, of course, because he wanted to marry Persephone, but her mother, Demeter, said, I'm not having him as a son-in-law. And anyway, there's quite a bit of interest. There's a lot to say about the story, but it's not necessarily relevant here. But I had a client once who was whispering to a colleague about somebody else in the workplace, maybe the boss, but some other person in the workplace. And she was talking about this person's personal hygiene or lack of it. And it, just like the cliche, they didn't realise that the tannoy was switched on. And so her comments could be heard by all and sundry, and the person she was talking about. Now that's a real experience of, I think we could all feel that embarrassing feeling. Now, I'm not saying that Pluto transits always bring that about, but it's the sort of thing that happens. What would have happened, one way of viewing the myth when Hades abducted Persephone is that it was a death of her innocence. that's what the story is actually about. It's partly a story to do with nature, and winter and things dying and growing and all that sort of stuff. But it's also partly to do with she was ready to be plucked. It was a death of her innocence. And that's what Pluto transits often do. They precipitate or coincide, if you like, synchronize with events that help us become streetwise. They strip us of our innocence. That's almost the main thing that Pluto does: strip us of our innocence. Pluto, we know, concerns itself with birth and death process in nature. And as I was saying a minute ago, the idea that in the winter everything looks dead. There's no leaves, there's no flowers, there's no fruit. But in the bowels of the earth, the seeds of renewal are lurking, sleeping, if you like. So Pluto, we know, is a planet that we associate with death, with rebirth, with regeneration, with the story about the phoenix rising out of the ashes. So something has to die before new growth can take place. So Pluto is often involved in the development of something new. It enforces a crisis. Pluto, along with Uranus, are the two planets in collective terms that we associate with volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. And in either of those instances, the land cannot go back to exactly how it was before it happened. In the natal chart, Pluto will often describe things that are hidden, maybe hidden from us. This can be very collective, family stuff, the taboos in the closet, really. And the purpose of Pluto, as I said a minute ago, is often about becoming streetwise. Anything that is hidden, buried, firmly pushed down may create symptoms. It stops growth. So in youth, you may have situations, or in different times of life, you push things down, you hide it, you hide it, you hide it. And that's a Pluto issue, to hide, to bury, to push down. But it's also a Pluto stuff to bring it up, just like a dog, burying the bone, digging it up. So Pluto, as various astrologers have pointed out, Pluto is very much the planet to associate with taboos, the taboos in life. The eventual decay of our body, going to the toilet. Everybody has to do these things. And as a death planet, we're reminded that we all die in the end, we all decay in the end, that death is the great leveller. And the knowledge of these things helps us prioritize. And I think that is also one of the purposes of Pluto transits, to help us prioritize. If we know, for example, that we're going to die tomorrow, next week, or next month, or in 20 years, what would we do in our allotted time? So prioritizing keeps things in perspective. And that's part of the Pluto process. And you'll hear a lot of these words begin with a P sound, very Pluto sort of sounds. Pluto means rich one, rich. God was rich in dead souls and rich in all the stuff beneath the earth, the seeds and the minerals. And one of the names for Pluto, along with Hades, is dis, which means rich. But we have words like discharge, dismiss, and what they mean is to get rid of, to remove, to release, to get rid of. And that's what Pluto transits often do, and they can be very cleansing from that point of view. We get rid of rubbish. Sometimes Pluto transits just take us down into the underworld, and it can be in a very just a physical way, so stuff to do with sewers and the underground tube station, underground tube if you have a tube where you live, so sewers and drains and plumbers, but also real wealth and power that's unseen. And that can be things. But one of the main things that happens for most people is that Pluto brings things to a head. Pluto doesn't cause awful things just to happen out of the blue. Pluto transits just force us to deal with unresolved issues. And you sometimes find that not a lot happens with a Pluto transit. And that can be because you've had previous Pluto transits and they've dealt with the stuff in some sense. So it's the stuff of elimination. And when Pluto is in a sign, the given sign it is, gives us a clue to what segments of society are going to be persecuted, purged or downsized. In Capricorn, it's a difficult time for business, it's a difficult time for government, it's also a difficult time for the elderly, Capricorn, the elderly. So if any of you have seen the film Secrets and Lies by Mike Leigh, this is a very Pluto film, when throughout the film each of the characters has to own parts of themselves that they rather are kept hidden. I can't remember the film too much, but the black woman discovers that who's been adopted discovers that her biological mother is white. The white mother discovers or remembers that her biological daughter is black and is embarrassed by that. One of the other characters discovers he's infertile and has to, anyway, each character has a kind of Pluto transit, which is quite interesting. Anyway, it's an example of a Pluto film. Let's look at a few examples. Okay. So Dominic Strauss-Kahn is a Frenchman, an economist, a lawyer and a politician. He was the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, which is an international organisation of, I think it's about 188 countries, which works to foster global monetary cooperation. So it's about financial stability around the world. And he was tipped to be, at the time, France's next president. So he had a very senior job, but he was tipped to be France's next president. And then, and here on slide 11, you can see his chart. So I want you to notice the two red arrows. You'll see that transiting Pluto at 7 degrees is square his MCIC at 8 degrees of Aries and Libra respectively. So he's got Pluto square MCIC and he's got transiting Uranus exactly on his moon, 3 degrees of Aries. So in May 2011, a chambermaid, moon in Aries in the north, moon in the 9th house, a foreign woman, a chambermaid in a New York hotel where he was staying, alleged that he had sexually assaulted her. And semen was found on the woman, and it matched his, on the woman's blouse, matched his semen, his DNA, so he couldn't really get out of it. And since then, many other women have stepped forward and said that they had been sexually assaulted by him. Effectively, it was the end of his political career. And here, Pluto, MC, career, his whole, the MC, the 10th house, is all about your status, your reputation, you at your most public, and Pluto is squaring that, okay? And the Uranus conjunct the moon, the shock of it. So that would be one example. I don't want you to think that these sort of things always happen under Pluto transits. For most people, there is nothing like that, you know. But if there is something to be ashamed about or embarrassed or something that one is hiding, then you can bet your bottom dollar that it will come up under a Pluto transit. So here is another example. This is of a politician called Chris Huhne, who was in a political party over here called the Liberal Democrats, and was himself tipped to perhaps become the leader of the Liberal Democrats at some time in the future. Now, we do not have a birth time for this man, but the birthday is the 2nd of July 1954, and you'll notice that he has a Sun-Jupiter conjunction in Cancer. So we don't know what house this is because we don't have a birth time, but he's definitely got that conjunction. Anyway, he got caught speeding in 2003, and at the time his wife, whose name is Vicky Price, claimed that she was driving the car and accepted the penalty points on his behalf. So he'd been speeding, police had caught him, but they both said that she had been driving. And for years, he insisted, the press kept on and on about it, but for years he said that she had been driving. And then she discovered that he was having an affair, and she went to the newspapers and admitted that she had lied to protect him and that he had been driving. So can you see that Pluto is opposing the Sun-Jupiter conjunction? Pretty exact. So he had to step down as a politician, and he had all the embarrassment, and they were both sent to jail for a short time because of perverting the course of justice, is what the allegation is. Anyway, they didn't stay in jail very long, and she's already got a top job in some other. She was an economist and had some kind of top job and all the rest of it. So the thing about Pluto transits are that although one can be sort of completely crushed, usually the person actually comes back, just like the phoenix out of the ashes. And I'm sure that there will be a future for Chris Huhne as well. Here we see the chart for Alex Salmon, and he was a Scottish MP for the Scottish National Party, known as the SNP. And in September 2014, the Scottish people had a vote. There was a referendum to decide whether Scotland wanted to be a country independent of the rest of the United Kingdom. And he is the person that led the campaign for Scotland to become independent. This is what he fervently wanted. He did nothing wrong, but the Scots narrowly voted against. Scotland voted to stay as part of the United Kingdom and not to become independent. Well, as I say, he did nothing wrong. But for him, the no vote, I would argue, was deeply humbling. You'll notice that transiting Pluto is conjunct his sun Mercury, so he was humbled. But in the end, he is standing for Parliament on his own. He's not been completely crushed, but he was crushed for a moment. He was humbled by it. He really thought the Scots would vote to become independent. Just before we finish, I want to say a little something about Chiron, which is slide 8. I'm not expert on Chiron. I don't think anybody is, actually. But I do want to say a few things about my understanding of the planet. Or it's not a planet, really. It's another dwarf planet. But astrologers have been studying it since its discovery in, 1978, 1979. And as we've seen, Pluto transits may force us to sort out the sins of our fathers, not necessarily our own individual problems. But I think Chiron is very much to do with dealing with what I think of as previous bodges. Pluto has a 50-year cycle, as you can see here. Like Pluto, it has a very elliptical orbit, so it can spend 2 years in a sign, 8 years in a sign. But the word Chiron has the same source as that of hand. And in mythology, Chiron was a handyman. And whilst astrologers have come up with all the idea of Chiron and the healer, I agree with the notion personally, a notion put forward by an astrologer called Eve Jackson. I agree with the notion that Chiron is more of a handyman than a healer. And in fact, all the words chiropractic, chiropody come from the same source. And Chiron was supposed to be adept with his hands and his feet. And I think one of the things that sometimes happens with Chiron transits is that we're forced to sort out a situation which we thought had previously been fixed. We thought it was dealt with, but actually it was a bodge, it was a mistake, it wasn't done properly. And under Chiron transit, certainly one manifestation I've noticed is that we have to bring in the expert, not just a handyman, but an expert, someone who can really put it right. And occasionally you may find under Chiron transits that you yourself are the expert, that you have to deal with the previous bodge, if you like. So Chiron, I think, brings us back to our wounds. Chiron is associated with wounds. It's always the idea of the wounded healer, but I think it's much more about the wounds. It needn't be something deep and psychological. It could be the fact that you're hopeless at gardening or not very good with money or whatever. So you have to get an expert in to deal with that which you can't. And like Pluto, Chiron inevitably brings us back to the healing power of nature, the stuff of alternative medicine very often. And of course it's interesting that Pluto was discovered at the time of the rise of the hospice. And Pluto and Chiron, along with Pluto, is one of the death planets, I think. And I think it also has to do with recording. Like when you're listening to a recording, you have a rerun of something. It's saying something about having a rerun of things. I guess Chiron is like a mini or bite-sized Pluto in its effects. And in its impact, it seems to come somewhere between Saturn and Pluto. By transit, it often comes, as I say, it's this idea of recording. It pushes us to going back over old material. It's where one says, oh no, not that again. And as many astrologers have noticed, that Chiron resists categorization. But it is often about those things where experts will shake their heads and say, I can't understand it. I've checked everything on your computer or car or your x-rays or your bloods, whatever. I'm completely mystified. And you have to go back over something and sort it finally. That is something that sometimes happens. I wouldn't say always does. Anyway, I invite you to study Chiron and to see what it means for you. As I say, I don't want you to think that Pluto transits inevitably bring crises, but they do sometimes. And I want to show you, I want to give you an example here of somebody who, had a heart attack. And his name actually is Terry Hart. He has given his permission for me to use his chart, so it's quite interesting that his name is Hart. Anyway, he been an astrologer. He's an astrologer. He had the exact time that he had his heart attack, and he said to me that he couldn't see any astrological transits to describe the event. The event was 9th of June 2012 at about 8:30 in the morning. And in 2012, as on and off for the last few years, the Uranus-Pluto square was exact. It is exact in the sky, actually, but the issue is that they are sesquiquadrate. Each planet is 135 degrees from Terry's Sun at 21 of Leo. Because what planets and signs do you associate with the heart? Well, undoubtedly the Sun and Leo, the planet and the sign, Sun and Leo, and he has the Sun in Leo Pluto and Mercury in Leo. And so the Uranus and Pluto both hit his sun. So out of the blue, he had an event that is, well, life-changing and potentially could be the end of your life. But actually, in true Pluto style, he got over it quite quickly. It wasn't a major heart attack, and he completely transformed his life, his whole lifestyle and how he eats. And in fact, he told me that he follows Bill Clinton's dietary advice. Apparently Bill also had a heart attack, and I think is also born very close date to Terry. But that's an example of don't ignore the Uranus and Pluto transits. I mean, there may be progressions and directions, almost definitely will, that would add other information. But nevertheless, you can see it. So don't ignore semi-squares and sesquiquadrates, and you can use your computer to help you find these. But particularly when there's two of them. The odd one you can ignore, but the Uranus-Pluto square, both picking up his sun, can't possibly ignore that. Anyway, I'm going to finish now and hopefully look forward to talking to you in film number 2 when we'll talk more about transits and other techniques that you might choose to use. Bye for now.